I have always been fascinated by God. Why do people all around the world worship their God or gods so differently? So I'm setting off on a journey to understand how God has helped us answer the biggest questions we have about our place in the universe.
This is Infants on Thrones, the philosophies of men mingled with humor. We are the Core.
Welcome back to Infants on Thrones. I'm Glenn Ostland, and this is episode 572, Expectations, Faith Crisis, and God Over Good with Luke Norsworthy. Now, what if you dedicated your life to a certain direction? You put all your eggs in one basket and then came to the stark realization that not only is the basket not really a basket, but maybe your eggs aren't even really eggs. Does that sound familiar at all to any of you out there? Luke Norsworthy is a Christian pastor who experienced a faith crisis when he saw that the Bible and his expectations of God didn't really stack up against what he was seeing around him in the real world.
Well, I think it's at that point that you have to decide if you're going to just give up, you're going to walk away, or you're going to realize that this is an invitation to have a deeper, more authentic connection to who God is.
Now, Luke recently wrote about his faith crisis in the book, God Over Good. Luke also runs a weekly podcast called Newsworthy with Norsworthy and is a 7 on the Enneagram, just like me. So what's that you say? You don't know anything about the Enneagram or Luke Norsworthy or how or why anyone would possibly choose to keep believing in God after going through a faith crisis? Well, then you're in for a real treat, because that's what I discussed today with Luke Norsworthy, even though I was a little sick at the time. And that discussion starts now. Enjoy. Hello.
Hello. Glenn, how are you?
Good. How are you?
All right, good. Do I have my video on? Start video. There we go.
Hey, nice to see you. Nice to put a face to that voice I've been listening to for a while.
Right on, man. Right on. Well, it's great to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you too.
So you're feeling under the weather today?
Yeah, I've got some kind of a cold, and throat stuff going on.
You sound good. You don't sound bad.
Oh, really? Thanks.
I've sounded worse than that when I've been talking in public, so you'll be fine.
Cool. So I think I told you in the email, I found out about the Enneagram maybe about a year ago, and then my wife got more interested into it a couple months ago. So we've been listening to things, and then we started listening to Suzanne's podcast.
Yeah.
What's it called? My Enneagram Journey?
Sure, that sounds right.
I think that's what it is. I'm a 7. And you're a 7.
Yes.
And
yeah,
so that's how I heard you being interviewed by Suzanne as a 7. And I went, I like this guy. And it sounds like we've got some things in common. And this is a world as a Christian pastor that I don't really know anything about. I was raised Mormon. I went on a Mormon mission to Japan. And then I started studying folklore in graduate school, and my faith started unraveling. And so as I was reading your book, God Over Good, there were several things in there that I'm like, oh yeah, I went through that kind of struggle. Mm-hmm. And it's just so interesting to me that here you are as a Christian pastor that went through some kind of a faith crisis. You've Humpty Dumpty's fallen apart. You've found a way to pick it up and put it back together again. And these are the kinds of conversations I'm having with my audience of Mormons that have been through something similar. So I thought, let's hear what Luke's got to say about this. And
right on.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, Luke, and, like growing up as a Christian, making the decision to become a pastor and all the schooling that required.
Yeah, I grew up, my dad was a psychologist, and that's actually what I wanted to do when I went off to college. I went to college a little bit early, and so I went to college when I was 16, and so I didn't really have as much life experience. And so I just thought, I'm just going to do what dad did, and it's going to be a psychologist. And then during my freshman year, it became clear to me that what I was most interested in studying was theology. And I figured, what I'm most interested in is probably what I should find something to do vocationally. even though there's no one in my family who was a pastor, didn't like have a close connection. I mean, we were part of churches. My whole family's part of church, but we weren't like super tight with a preacher, pastor, or something like that. It was just something that I thought, this is what I'm interested in doing. And then my sophomore year, I transferred from college in Arkansas to Texas, and I started preaching at little country churches. And I just fell in love with it, and ended up getting an undergrad degree in Christian ministry. That's what it's called, as a religious school. And so Christian ministry undergrad, and then I went to seminary there and got a master's of divinity, and that's my schooling.
Yeah. And it's so what's it like growing up as a Christian? Because, like as Mormons, we always would kind of compare ourselves against Christians and say, oh, Christians have got it right up to here and here. And then we've got it right up to here, but nobody really knows. I mean, they don't really spend any time finding out what Christians really think or believe or what their life is like. So what was it for you growing up?
Yeah, I think that's probably similar to my experience with Mormonism, is that we would just like cherry pick stuff that we thought, oh, we could use this and say that they're wrong by just this, thing that has no real context or background or like any humanity. Like, I'm just going to, just say whatever I want about it. Sure. Anyway, so my experience growing up, it was a good experience. I mean, there's some people whose religious upbringing causes them a lot of damage and things that they'll have to unpack later. And I think, thanks a lot to my mom and dad, it was a home in which religion was fostered in a healthy environment, that God was always for you, that it was always loving. And whether you are Christian or not, or religious or not, I think the science shows us if the deity which you ascribe to is a hateful deity, then it makes you more of a hateful person. And if the deity you ascribe to, true or not, is a loving deity, it makes you more of a loving person. And so regardless of the veracity of my faith, it was a loving, good environment for me to grow up in. Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about some of the things that started shaking your faith in that, because I've talked about this recently on the podcast, my podcast, Infants on Thrones, that even saying the word God now for me is so hard. And I think you talked about that also in your book. You have to reframe, what does it mean when you say it? What does it mean when you hear other people talk about it? How did that start with you?
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask you a question before I start?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Infants on Thrones. I felt like this was like a Game of Thrones podcast. When I first got the email, I was like, all right, let's do this. Wall walkers, whatever we're going to talk about the night. I don't know. But does it have anything to do with Game of Thrones?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with Game of Thrones except for the word thrones. So the name Infants on Thrones, the Mormon founder Joseph Smith gave a sermon once called the King Follett Discourse, and King Follett's the name of a guy, and it was his funeral. So he's talking at the funeral of King Follett, and in the course of the conversation or the sermon, at one point he looked out at these mothers that were in the congregation and saying, in the context of a funeral, some of you mothers wonder whether you will see your children again, children that died in infancy. Will you ever have a chance to be with them again? And so he went and he speculated, and he said that those children, those infants, live on in the afterlife. You'll hold them again. And in fact, there are thousands upon thousands of infants enthroned in the heavens. And so that's where we took our name, Infants on Thrones, because we thought it was an interesting image. We thought, as far as amateur podcasters that are talking about our own faith crisis, that we're kind of infants in a sense. We're still kind of making our way in the world, trying to figure things out. And this microphone that we talk into and broadcast out to people is, in a sense, a throne that we're sitting upon. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where it came from.
I like it.
Started around the same time of Game of Thrones, but yeah, it wasn't.
So we're not going to do anything about the dragons or anything. Okay,
we could if you want to.
This is Infants on Game of Thrones. The philosophies of men mingled with dragons. We are the Soul Assault.
That's your podcast, man. But I love the name, and I love the play on word, and I think the imagery of saying something like that in a funeral is really beautiful. So well done picking the name. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack your question, but I do have a podcast too, so sometimes I ask questions, and
love it.
Happens. Okay, question: when did my faith start kind of unraveling? And
And maybe because this was something that you said, it was kind of an offhanded comment in that interview that you did with Suzanne on her podcast. But you talked about how you do stand-up comedy, and there's certain routines that you do for certain audiences. And so I'm assuming you're going to be kind of careful about what you say on this, but I don't want you to. I want you to just say what you think and say what you feel. But so if you could give me an indication of anything that you're saying that's like, well, this is how I would say it to this audience. This is how I'd say it to that audience. But it's got to be a tough position.
You know, honestly,
and to question stuff.
Yeah, I'm in an environment where I am very fortunate to have our leadership structure. We have elders, which I know you guys are familiar with that terminology as well.
Sure,
but we have our board, our elders that I report to are people who have my back. They believe in what I'm doing. Cool. They knew about the book. They knew what I was saying in it, and they were supportive. And so I don't feel like I really need to
pull any punches.
Yeah, I don't have to tiptoe around the stuff that I believe in the stand-up thing. I mean, that's more tongue in cheek of, I mean, there's some jokes that are a little bit more cutting in a comedy club than I would do in a church service, obviously. Yeah. But that's basically it. My faith started to have issues when I was in grad school, and I started to realize the Bible didn't make as much sense as I thought it did, and it didn't fit my expectations for what I think my sacred text should be. And there were contradictions or things that just like didn't line up. Yeah. There's things in the Jewish text that are just like, this is one account and there's another account afterwards that is clearly different account. Like the most notable one, I think I mentioned in the book, is there's a story about David doing a census, which is a sign of like unfaithfulness to God because it shows your trust in how many people you have. And so he knew it was wrong. Well, in 1 Samuel, it says that God inspired David to do this sinful thing. God caused him to do this. Well, in Chronicles, which is a book that's written much later, according to most historians, it says that it was not God that tempted David to do this, but it was Satan who did. Which God and Satan, like those are like two pretty different entities. Like, that's not like an accidental whoops, And so part of it was just like, okay, I had this expectation for how Scripture is supposed to work, but it wasn't just like these intellectual inconsistencies. It was like the real life experiences of things that just didn't go the way I expected them. I had a roommate in college who was trying to figure out his sexual identity, and he was going to church service and thought, well, I'll pray away the gay, and all of a sudden that I'll never have this orientation again. It was, a job of mine that my first job was this train wreck, my first job out of seminary. It was, my brother's divorce. It was my mom's chronic illness. So there are intellectual issues, but there's also like real life suffering. And all those things kind of culminated in a season in which my faith just didn't work. And so I can't say there was like just one thing, but it was all of them.
I like what you said about expectations, and you talk about that a lot in your book. There's a phrase, help me get it right. It's that expectations are future resentments, something along those lines.
Premeditated.
Yeah.
Discipline. Yeah. I think that comes from Alcoholics Anonymous, to be honest. But when you expect something to live into your picture of the future, you don't have control of that. And so when you say, okay, this road is going to take me from Dallas to Phoenix, what if the road doesn't go there? What if it goes north and south instead of east and west? Like I don't get to determine where the road goes, yet I can have an expectation for what my future is going to be like, what a relationship is going to be like. And then I did that with God. And I don't get to dictate how spirituality unfolds. I don't. Like I'm a part of the process of my experience, but I don't get that power. But I was functioning in a way that I thought I should.
How are those expectations generated? Because I think about with Mormonism, like we've got and I say we, I'm not Mormon anymore. I mean, I was raised Mormon, so I'm like wired that way, but I'm not believing or practicing. But there's a prophet who, leads and guides. He speaks for God to the church. And so what the prophet says, anything that comes out in our Sunday manuals that we would use that goes through a correlation committee. These are the things that set the expectations of what the nature of God is. What if you live this way, then these things are going to happen. And so I can understand from a Mormon perspective where there's like this prophet on earth that is representing God, how those expectations are set. How is it? Because with the Christian tradition that you've been raised in, you don't really have that kind of top down. Like you mentioned, there's a group of elders that you report to, but how are those expectations usually set?
I think from my experience and the experience of the people that I've interacted with and had some sort of spiritual directive role in their life, from what I've gathered, expectations accumulate like stains on a white couch. Like they just show up and you don't know exactly where they come from. I mean, there's some that are overt, which would be similar to what you just described of, okay, I went to school and someone taught me this and, I read the Bible and I interpreted it this way. And so there's an expectation that develops from something that's like overtly formative. But I think it can be everything from the family you grew up in, your family of origin, your dad, the latest Morgan Freeman movie, whatever mythology that you might have stumbled into as a child, and you think, I'm going to hold on to that because that can be a normative narrative for my life. And so I think they're just all around us, and we're constantly just in this consumption of ideas. I don't know if you're, speaking of stand-up comedy, I don't know if you're a fan of stand-up, but there was kind of like a scandal or whatever in the comedy world years ago when Dane Cook was kind of at the zenith of his career. And the issue was that he supposedly stole a joke from another comedian.
I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was Louis C.K. And obviously, Louis had far more substantial problems in his life than stealing someone's jokes. But Louis in his sitcom depicted this scene in which he and Dane had this confrontation. And what Louis says to Dane is,
I don't think that you saw me do those jokes and said, I'm going to tell those jokes too. I don't think there's a world where you're that stupid or that bad a guy. I do think, though, that you're like a machine of success. You're like a rocket, and you're rocketing to the stars, and your engines are sucking stuff up. Stuff is getting sucked up in your engines like birds and bugs and some of my jokes. I think you saw me do them. I know you saw me do them, and I think they just went in your brain. And I don't think you meant to do it, but I don't think you stopped yourself either. And that's why I never felt the need to help you not be hated by a lot of people.
His assumption was that he didn't intentionally steal Louis' joke, but that maybe he heard it one time, it went in his head, he adapted to his own, and he started to think it was his own. And I think that's how expectations happen. You don't maybe intentionally do this. It's around you, you consume them, and all of a sudden you start to base things upon them. And that's the problem.
So what were some of these expectations? You mentioned a couple of them, but you had some expectations about the nature of God. You had some expectations about the way that your life would unfold in certain ways.
Yeah. I think expectations about how a sacred text is supposed to work was front and center for me. I would also say that the expectations for how my life would go, like if I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to serve God, I'm going to be a pastor, therefore good things are always going to happen to me. Like that sort of, it's a watered down version of prosperity gospel. Like if I do the good things, then God's going to make me financially prosper. Obviously I never thought to be rich, but I thought I would never get fired from my first job. And expectations that, churches would always function a certain capacity, that if these are God's people and God is good, then how come people in God's community don't always treat people well, don't always act good to each other? So those are some of the big ones.
All right. And then where do you go once you recognize that those expectations that you've built up for yourself about something as big and important as God, that it's wrong? What do you do with that?
Well, I think it's at that point that you have to decide if you're going to just give up, you're going to walk away, or you're going to realize that this is an invitation to have a deeper, more authentic connection to who God is. And so I tell this parable in the book about there's a man who grew up on a beach, not like Tom Hanks living in his Malibu beach house, right, but like Tom Hanks in Castaway. And he knew all along that water is bad. He just knew, I'm not supposed to be around. So he builds a sandcastle to keep the water away. And every day he's trying to keep the water away. But the problem with water is it always seeps through and creates cracks and little holes in his sandcastle. And so every day he's putting sand to trying to keep the water out, until one day a huge wave comes in and washes him out to sea. And the whole time he's trying to fight to get back to the land, because he knows that the water is going to kill him. But eventually he comes to the surface and he realizes that the water is not trying to drown him, but to deliver him. And for me, like, what I did is I tried to create this wall of certainty where I had God and life and the world figured out. And what I think in the midst of it was that God was not trying to destroy my faith, but I think God was actually the one delivering me from the certainty, the idol that I'd created of how I wanted God and the world and life to work. And I realized that actually this invitation to lose what I started with was not bad for my faith, but it was actually the necessary, conflict that I needed to move into this next stage of faith for me. But not everyone can do that. Some people, it doesn't go the way they want and they're just done with faith. But others of us have found a way that, I can get washed out to sea, but then I can realize that the sea is not destroying me, but it's delivering me.
Did you go through that? Did you ever touch or flirt with atheism at all as you were questioning God? I
would probably choose agnosticism over atheism.
Sure.
But similar camp. Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, and if I'm being quite honest, like, I think it was, maybe it's Dawkins who talked about the 7-point scale of certainty. And he says, I'm a 6.9 agnostic. Yeah. And there's a 0.1% that I could be wrong, but 6.9 out of 7% of me is certain that there is no God. And I would say I'm the opposite end of the spectrum. Like, I'm a 0.1, and I'm fairly certain that God exists, but there are moments that I'm always going to have questions. There are times that I wake up and go, is this all just like this great myth that has been perpetuated from one generation to the next to give meaning and identity to people, but it's not actually true? So I probably will always have part of me that goes, you sure?
Yeah, right.
But at this point, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not afraid of there being a little bit of question, a little bit of uncertainty in my belief system.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring up Dawkins' 7-point scale. I came across that several years ago when I was still trying to figure out where I sit in my own faith crisis, and I went away from that going, "Wow, I'm right where Dawkins is. I'm a 6 out of 7." And if I'm remembering it right, the 6 means that you think that it's most likely that there is no God, to the point that you're not living your life as if there's any God watching, or whatever that is. And I just, in being honest with myself, I had to go, wow, I have started living my life as if there's not a God out there keeping track of me or watching. But it was hard for me to accept that, being 6, because I wanted there to be. And there wasn't any room in that scale for what do people want? What do you wish that there was? And so I've been in that space pretty much, 10 years maybe, but still. And then more recently started going in, okay, let me try to understand or set different expectations around what God is, or what God would be, or what people are talking about when they're making reference to God. And I don't know if that's moving me away from a 6 on Dawkins' scale. I may always be there, because I think that pretty much anybody's, when they're talking about God, they're really talking about themselves. They're talking about their projection on the world, or their expectations, or things like that. But there's such a value in looking at things as being bigger than ourselves that I feel like I've closed myself off from, in a sense, with that. And so I'm wondering if you have any experience with that through your own journey, Luke.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm probably like I said, the opposite end of the spectrum. Otherwise, it'd be pretty arduous to do my job if I was on the 6 side of the scale. But yeah, I'm for you, like, you always had, maybe I'm overstepping, but as I understand what you're saying, like, you always have that, like, I really would like to, right? And so maybe for you, that's the polar opposite of me going, I really don't know. And so each of us is always going to have this nagging itch. And to some degree, I think our faith is the accumulation of the practices that we do. Mm-hmm. And if you live as though God doesn't exist, then what you will probably see is a world in which God is absent. And I think the Christian faith has always been one, not just of this is what I think. It's not been just simply a mental assertion that you hold to, but it's a way of life, a way of practices. It's a community that you enter into, and in that way, even if your ideas don't match up to maybe what quote unquote Christian theology is supposed to be, if your practices, if your behavior, and if your belonging fits into that, it can carry it through. And so I'm not as concerned that someone is able to mentally ascend to all the quote unquote check marks as much as I'm concerned of like, what are the practices that you are doing that are dictating the kind of life that you want to live? And for me as a follower of Jesus, it means there's certain things that I always have to have present in my life. Like I have to pray. Like that is really important to me. I have to be surrounded in Christian community of people who I can be transparent and honest with, and people that I can name the demons that I have, metaphorically speaking, and things that pull me away from who I want to be. And if I was to always be able to check a box that says, I believe this to be true, but I didn't have any of those things, I think my faith would be in far more trouble than it is the other way around.
Yeah, that sense of community is so important, and having those people around you to reinforce the ways that you want to live your life. Where do you fall on like literal versus metaphoric interpretations of Scripture? And because this is where in my it was difficult for me to leave Mormonism because there were so many things about it that I wanted to hold on to, but I felt like I couldn't, because my way of holding on to it would be a more metaphorical interpretation, and other people around me wanted a literal interpretation to help bolster their faith, and I couldn't do that.
Could do both.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I get that.
Do you have things like that in your congregation?
Yeah, I would say, me personally, I think I try to read the Bible literally, which means there is some parts that I think is metaphor. I think it's a poetic story. It's the creation story. For me, the historical veracity of being a 6-day actual creation, it's non-existent. Like that's not important to me. I think the point of the story is that God created the world, and it's good. Like that's important to me. I think the second creation story, I'm saying these things assuming that your audience has some familiarity with it. I think
so.
Okay.
That in Genesis chapter 1, there's a different version than Genesis chapter 2 of the creation story.
Yeah. So the first one is God speaks, creation happens. And then day 6, Adam and Eve are created. And day 7, God rests, right? Whereas the second creation story of Genesis 2, it's, God creates Adam, and then God creates all weird like mixture of like Animal Planet / The Bachelor, where God tries to match him up with the animals, and that doesn't work out. And so God makes him fall asleep and then rips out a lung, or a rib, and create. Thank you for being the Christian pastor. Well done, man. Bonus points for that one. But like these are two different stories that I don't see a way to harmonize them in an honest way, but that doesn't bother me. Now, what I would say is some of those, especially those like Old Testament texts, I can read them metaphorically, and it doesn't do anything for my faith. The New Testament, like the life and the person of Jesus, is the central one to me. And so I personally, I need Jesus to be a real person, and I need that to be. And so some of the miracles, and maybe some of those are exaggerated. Okay, that doesn't affect me. But in a lot of ways, it hinges on the death, burial, and resurrection. And so I'm a person who believes literally that Jesus died and he literally was rose again. Now, everything else is a secondary thing to me, that I'm okay if it's a metaphor. I'm okay if it's poetic. I'm okay if it's a myth that has truth in it, like the story of Jonah and the whale. Jonah is this prophet, runs away from God, throws in the water. A fish swallows him up, stays there for 3 days.
A big fish.
A big fish. It's
not a whale. It's a big fish.
It's a fish, but it's probably a whale. But here's the thing: the real story is that Jonah's heart was swallowed by hate. Like the point of the story is that he hated his enemies. Yeah, that's the point. It's not like about a fish or a whale or whatever swallowed him, right?
And his fear and avoidance of doing what it was that he was supposed to do, and
And I think Scripture wants us to read it literally, because there's stuff in there that goes, we're trying to tell you a ridiculously funny story. Like the animals have sackcloth and ashes on them in Nineveh. Like the text is clearly going, this is ridiculous. He says 3 times at the end in chapter 4, I would rather die than these people live. Like he's cursing because like a vine dies over him and it doesn't give him the sunlight. So the story itself, I think elicits the kind of reading that maybe some people want to run away from, but I think that's where I'm actually invited to.
If we can go back for a minute to the creation story and the different versions of it, have you come across in your studies? There's a book that I read several years ago called "Who Wrote the Bible" by Richard Friedman, and he talks about like the E source and the P source and the D source and the J source, and he's basically saying that the version of the Old Testament that we have right now was written at different times by different people for different political motivations. And then at a later period, it was all put together because as the kingdoms were reuniting, they wanted to bring all these different traditions together. But that's why there's some contradictions in there, because these were all developing from oral tradition and that sort of thing. Does that type of... Yeah.
No, that's a theory that was originally presented by a guy named Wellhausen, and it's called the New Document Hypothesis, or JDEMP.
Yeah.
There's a Deuteronomic historian, there's the priestly source, and then there's two different names that God gets, Yahweh and Elohim, J and E. And so what they've looked at is how come in some of these texts God is called Yahweh and then other texts it's called Elohim? And how come you have these kind of redundant stories that, like I said, are somewhat contradictory? And so the theory is that you have a compiler, an editor who brings all these oral traditions, like you said, together. And so, that's honestly how I interpret those texts and I think it functions that way. And so you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is probably priestly source because the climax of the first creation story is Sabbath, which is the day of worship. And so you have the priest who's like, hey, the most important thing is that it builds all towards a worship service. And so, I think those things are helpful to color and influence how we read the text. Obviously, we've never found any historical evidence outside of like our text to go, this is exactly what happened.
Sure.
But my Old Testament and Hebrew professor studied at Harvard, and he looked exactly like you would expect someone who studies Hebrew at Harvard to look like. And he was like this brilliant guy. And so at one point he just joked around. He goes, I spent my whole life studying these texts that none of us have actually found yet. And it all comes down to simply just loving people.
Yeah.
And that's my theology. Is there's a lot of complex layers and questions to go through, but I think God is summed up in the person of Jesus, and Jesus says the main thing to do is you love God and love people.
Yeah. And I, my take on scripture these days is that this is ancient wisdom traditions that have been passed down to us. And I think there's far too much energy that's spent debating whether it's true or whether it's not true. It's the impact that it has, what it means. When I was studying folklore in graduate school, we learned that if a tradition doesn't have a function, something that is providing value to people, they'll stop doing it. And so if something is around, that means it's doing something, it's functioning, it's providing some value. So focus on what that is. So these stories, whether we want to say there's evidence to support that it's true or not, these stories exist. The Bible exists. People are reading it. They're having it influence their lives. Where is the value in it? Those are the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in. And I think as a pastor, you've got to see that on a daily basis with people. As a pastor, do you mainly stand up and preach, or are you more involved when people have problems in their lives? They bring it to you and ask you to help them with things. Tell me a little bit about what that's like being a pastor.
Well, the way the size of the church affects kind of the function of what the preacher does. And I've been preacher of a church of 20 people when I was in college. I started a church that was 100 people. I preached at church a couple hundred people. The one I'm at now is larger than that. And so a lot of my interaction is me talking to people from a stage on Sunday morning. Now, obviously, I interact with people, but there are a lot of other people who also are charged and given the opportunity to do that kind of stuff and serve our church that way. So, a lot of what I do is preaching, but one of the benefits I get to have as being a preacher, as someone who's, even if I don't I don't go to people's homes every night, and I don't our church is 1,000 people there every Sunday, and so I don't know everyone's name, but often when I do interact with some people who are not there every Sunday, but comes a couple times a quarter, something like that. When they do want to interact with me, it's because they're in the middle of a crisis, or they're having something substantial going on. And it is an absolute honor for me to kind of step into like the holy of holies of people's lives and to hear their real questions. And, hey, this happened. There was an affair and I'm trying to forgive and move forward. What do you have for me? Or how do I pray after, my kid passed away? Or how do I believe God is good if, suicide takes place in my family? And all these things are very like sacred to me to step into. And in those places, I don't think my job is to teach, right? Like there are times when people are in crisis where sometimes they would say something that I don't think is really the best way to read the text or to view God, but sometimes it's the only thing they can do to get through the day. And sometimes in those situations, I don't want to be like Job's friends. There's a story in the Jewish text of a guy named Job who like this poetic story of a guy who has everything, he loses everything, and his friends show up and they say, this is why it happened, because you did something wrong. Now, part of what they're expressing is an old understanding of Judaism of how if you're good, good things happen to you. Part of what the book of Job says is, our old understanding isn't actually working. And so we have to move forward and have a new way of viewing God. But the problem is the friends showed up in a time of crisis and they started teaching at him instead of being present with him. And one of the things I think is central to hospital visits or crisis counseling is to be present with someone, to be a voice of love. And the Christian story says that Jesus, God in the flesh, steps into the darkness, and so that we are not alone in the darkness. And so our job as Christians, especially as Christian leaders, a pastor, is to embody that sort of love with someone in the darkness.
Yeah. That's that. I admire that a lot. When you mentioned at some point, people will come to you and they'll have concerns. Why did this bad thing happen to me? Why is God, if God is good, and you talk about this in your book a lot too, is that the problem of evil, and it's the problem that Job tackles as well. If God is good, why are all of these bad things happening? How have you come to reconcile that question?
Well, I hate that I'm going to pitch the title of my book to you right now.
No,
that is
I
what's
want
going
you
to happen. But I think you have to choose God over good. And I mean, that's the point of what I was trying to say in the book, is that God is not always going to be good in my subjective definition of good. I have a definition of what a good sacred text is going to look like. That's not what I get. I have a picture of what I think a good God would do in like removing all adversity and suffering in the world. That's not the God that I've been presented with an option to serve. Like, that's not it. And so what I have to choose is the God that has been realized according to my faith in the person of Jesus and what I experience of God now. That's what I have been offered. And so for me, it's choosing that over some sort of unrealistic picture that's never going to come to fruition. And that's not easy. Like there's a loss, there's a mourning that you have to go through to go, man, I think God should act a certain way. And there are things that I still think we would be better off if God acted the way I think God should act.
Right.
But that's not reality. And so there is this loss. There's this terrible story in one of the Jewish texts. There's a book called Judges, which is a book that kind of like spirals down and down. It's like the worst, it is literally Game of Thrones. Like it's that sort of brutal violence. And there's one story that this guy says, I'm going to promise you, God, whatever greets me when I come home, and I'm going to sacrifice it to you. Now, the Hebrew is a little bit ambiguous, so he might be referring to like the livestock, which would typically be like maybe the first thing in his courtyard based on kind of the way the Jewish communities functioned or were established. But it could have been a person, not sure. But what does happen is that it is his daughter who comes out to greet him. And so he thinks he's supposed to sacrifice his daughter. Now, terrible story. I think that's a myth. I don't think God would want that to happen. If it did happen, literally, I think it's a misunderstanding of what God wants you to do. Like there's text in the Bible, don't sacrifice your kids, which is sad that you have to include that in the Bible, but such were the times. But I think this is how I would read that and appropriate that story. What happens next is this guy's name is Jephthah. His daughter says, I don't have any children, so let me go spend 3 months in the wilderness to bewail my virginity.
Right. Yeah.
And she's having to mourn the loss that she never gets to be a mother, which for many of us, being a parent is one of the best things that's ever happened to us. And so she has to go out in the wilderness for 3 months and mourn what she's never going to have. I think most of us in life have to go out into the wilderness and bemoan what we are never going to have. And some of us are never going to have the sort of intimacy in a relationship we want. Some of us are never going to have the relationship with God that we want. Some of us are never going to have just the life in general that we want. And what we have to do is to mourn the loss of what we're never going to get so that we can finally accept what we do have in front of us.
Yeah. I could do a lot with that story, Luke. But then I'm just exposing my expectations, right? So my expectations in a response to that story would be, why can't Japheth just say, I'm not going to kill you.
That's the right answer. Like you never should kill your kids. Like
right.
That's always the right answer. You
don't have to mourn your virginity. You don't so then the message of the story could be like, yes, there are certain things like intimacy in a relationship that you may never have, but you can also be the architect of the life that you live. And if you're in a relationship that doesn't have intimacy, or there's actually like some abuse and something like that, that doesn't mean that you have to.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that's where I get with the story.
And I think that's why, I think what the book of Judges is trying to do is trying to show you like, hey, stuff is really crappy here. Mm-hmm. And we need another system of government. And so our judges, which are more like half soldier, half like political figure, like these sort of judges aren't working. We need a king. That's kind of what the book of Judges is saying. Like, this is how bad things are getting. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, like, when you function that way, where you go, I think I got to kill my kid. Like, that's a sign that things are bad. And there are times that if that's happening, you need to go like, this isn't working. We need something different. We need another form of leadership in our life. If you're thinking that's the best option.
Yeah. I think my takeaway from your book was, letting go of your expectations of who or what God should be for you, and open yourself up to receiving whatever life brings you, and being grateful for whatever life brings you, finding the benefit in whatever life brings you. And that is choosing God over good, because it's your expectation. Your expectations that God should always be good doesn't match up with life and lived experience. So you're always going to be disappointed if you think that God is only good, or that, is that a correct summary?
I think you got it. Yeah. I would retweet that. That's good.
I know that garbled mess that I just gave you there.
No, but that's what I'm trying to say. You're exactly right.
Yeah. Cool. So we've got a couple of minutes left. And
you
the
want to
way
talk
that
Enneagram, don't you?
Yeah, I do want to talk about the Enneagram. I want to know how did you get interested in the Enneagram, and how does it help in your understanding of yourself and God and others around you that you're working with?
Have your listeners been like Enneagram 101? Like they know what it is?
I've given them a little bit of Enneagram background. Yeah.
And I've done that mainly on Patreon. So for those of you who are listening to this not through Patreon, let me give you a quick overview of the Enneagram. Enneagram means 9 written things. I mean, Ennea is 9, gram is like something that's written or drawn. So Enneagram means 9 things. It's 9 different personality types. It's actually much more complicated than that. But in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you some excerpts from the Liturgist podcast. It's their episode 37 on the Enneagram, and they go through really briefly here with these excerpts what each of these 9 types stand for. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Enneagram and you want to do it with Infants on Thrones, come support us on Patreon, because we're doing a lot of Enneagram stuff on Patreon right now. It's kind of fun. Anyway, here is some excerpts from the Liturgist podcast to give you an overview of the 9 types of the Enneagram.
Ones on the Enneagram are called the perfectionist or the reformer, and they literally see everything in terms of how it could be improved, how it could be better. 2s are helpers, and their way of seeing is based on sensing and meeting the needs of other people.
3s are called the achiever. Their need is to succeed or to appear like a success. They just want to project this image of being this performer who just is a production machine. What matters to 3s is that they avoid failure at all costs.
4s are people who are wedded to authenticity, and they're a little disappointed, I think, in the sellout from all of us to kind of try to be like each other. They really desire to have that unique flavor that everybody has to offer. There are people who are often called the romantic. Some people say that they have a need to be special or to be unique. I would say that I'm coming to believe they have a need to be known. 5s are in the mentally centered triad or the head triad of the Enneagram with 6s and 7s. And they are called the observer or the investigator. They need space and they need to perceive. And our definition of perceive would be to fully understand things.
The 6s are called either the loyalists or often the devil's advocates. 6s have a deep need to feel secure. They are fearful people when they tend to get real. The fear that they experience actually is probably closer to anxiety. That's sort of the dominant emotion that kind of runs, that kind of buzzes like one of those, like a fluorescent light that's gone bad in the background. It's just this buzz of anxiety that runs at a low level or in spikes from time to time. 7s, they are sometimes called the epicures. Sometimes we like to call them the enthusiasts. Every day to a 7 is like a school snow day. They just have this remarkable, sunny, incredible, enthusiastic, optimistic, the unlimited possibilities of life. They are just some of the most winsome, funny, great storytellers. They are always planning the great next adventure. The 8s are characterized by this tremendous intensity. They just are... let me give you an example of this. When an 8 walks into the room, you feel almost like the song Hail to the Chief should come on. You can feel this incredible energy radiating from that person, and it's really intensity, but what people often experience it as is anger. It's like this feeling that this person wants you to submit to them. It's this feeling that this person has come into the space and has just colonized it, almost annexed it with this tremendously big presence. 9s are called the peacemakers or the mediators. They have a real need to avoid conflict, and they need to avoid conflict at all costs. Because conflict can lead to disconnection in relationships. And the last thing they want is to feel disconnected from the people they love, or just from people in general.
Have your listeners been like Enneagram 101? Like they know what it is?
I've given them a little bit of Enneagram background. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so let's go forward with that. I was introduced by a Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr. Have you ever heard of Richard Rohr?
I've heard of Richard Rohr, yeah, but I haven't read any of the stuff.
He's one of the early kind of religious leaders to talk about the Enneagram in the United States. And he actually was Suzanne Stabile's teacher.
Mentor, yeah.
Right. And so I was going out to Albuquerque, New Mexico to do an interview with him. And I thought, hey, he has a book on the Enneagram. Let me kind of scan this one before I jump into the actual book at hand. And it's fascinating. So I talked to him a little bit about it. And
how long ago was this?
5 or 6 years ago, I think.
Okay. All right.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe at least 4, 5, whatever. It doesn't matter.
All right.
I don't think anyone's going to get on the computer and go, let's figure out exactly what year this was.
No, I'm just curious because for me, it's been really recent. And so I'm just trying to see how long you've been in it.
So it's been, that long. And then one of my friends was friends with Suzanne Stabile. Ian Cron, who wrote a book with Suzanne, was also a friend of mine. So because of the podcast and how long I've been... Do you know
Jana Reese?
I do not know.
Okay. Jana Reese edited that book for Suzanne, and then she wrote the study guide for the Path
Okay.
Yeah, and Jana's in the ex-Mormon community, and I know Jana.
Oh, okay. Nice. Yeah. No, I mean, if you're a friend of Suzanne, then I probably like you. So she's great.
Yeah.
But we became friends. Suzanne, there's a debate over what happened, but this is the true story that one of my friends that gave her my number, she calls me up and says, Luke, I want to do 9 podcast episodes with you. And I was like, oh, wow, I don't know you. This is kind of overwhelming. And long story short, we became good friends. She's actually going to be at our church in 2 weeks, and we're doing like an Enneagram and parenting event. And to answer your question, my life, my marriage, my faith, my parenting, all of this is substantially improved because of the Enneagram. It's given me a lens to understand myself. It's caused me to see people who are different from us 7s, who are not always optimistic and can spin things positively. And I don't think of them as less than me. Yeah. And when I see myself avoiding and running from pain, I go, okay, Luke, this is not where you need to be. Stay here. It's given me an ability to understand my wife, who's a 1 on the Enneagram, in a way that I wouldn't have before. It's given me grace for my coworkers. It's the people I work with. My whole staff has been taught the Enneagram. Many of my parishioners have gone through Suzanne's training. She's done conferences here before. So I'm all in on the Enneagram. Yeah. But like, I mean, in terms as a great tool, like I don't hold it to be as important as my like faith in Jesus, but it is a great tool.
What number do you think Jesus is on the Enneagram?
A 7, of course.
Of course, he's a 7. 7 is kind of the perfect number, isn't it?
I mean,
all of the like numerology and stuff. It always goes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's perfect. You're definitely not a 6. Yeah, exactly. No, what is Jesus? That's a Suzanne question. I think in a lot of ways but here's the thing. I think each number represents a facet of the image of God. Right. I think there's something about God in every single number. And so Jesus being the fullness of humanity, I think Jesus is probably in some ways like the perfect Enneagram number, like as in he's fully integrated in each different facet of the divine.
Yeah. I went to a workshop maybe a week or 2 ago, and the way that Carol, who I'm going to be interviewing next week, the way that she presented it, she talked about how when we're born into this world, we're kind of like a blank slate, like from the moment of conception, we're a blank slate. And that from that point, we grow into whatever it is that we grow into. And we've got like these neural pathways, we develop habits and that sort of thing. And the way she likes to think about the Enneagram is that when we're at that point of a blank slate, we kind of have all possibilities ahead of us. We could embody all of those things. So maybe like how you were saying about Jesus or God as representing all of the possibilities of life or humanity. Yeah. And then we kind of go in a certain way. We have certain inclinations. But I've liked how the Enneagram helps me see myself, my wife, how it helps me understand. What's that?
What's your wife on the Enneagram?
She's a 2.
Okay.
At first we thought she was a 6. Well, the first time I heard it, I thought she was a 2, and then she thought maybe she was a 6 for a while, and then we went back to 2.
How do you do dealing with the feelings?
I think that for me, so sevens tend to avoid feelings, and I think 7s tend to think that they do better with feelings than they actually do. So it might be kind of hard for 2 7s to talk about how we do about feelings.
Well, did you hear your answer? I said, "How do you do with the feelings?" And you go, "Well, I think."
Yeah. There we go. Yeah,
that's a typical 7 move that we all do. Like, I'm going to think about it. I'm not going to feel about it.
Yeah. I've had a lot of experiences in my life where I've had to kind of be in the feelings, and I haven't been able to escape from them quite as easily. So I think I've spent more times in doing shadow work or whatever you want to call it, just by virtue of going through a divorce, going through faith crisis, having losing a job, those kinds of times in life where, as a 7, you probably just want to put a happy face on it and get out of those spaces as quickly as you can. And I think I've been compelled in ways. We'll say that God's compelled me in ways to stay in that space because there's things that I need to learn. Yeah. So that's kind of how I see it. But I like that I have this new
awareness where I can kind of test it and go, all right, let's see, how do I do with the feelings? It's helped me with my wife, because as a two, where feelings are really important to her, that's how she processes the world. When there's a disconnect between the two of us, we can talk about it.
You're right, Past. I've had issues with being in a relationship with twos. Mm-hmm. And my mom's an 8, my brother's an 8, my dad's a 7. And so my family, there's stances in the Enneagram. So there's the withdrawn stance, which is the 9, the 5, and the 4. There's the dependent stance, which is the 1, 2, and the 6. And then you have the aggressive, which is the 8, 7, and the 3. And so my family, we're all aggressive. We'll get in your face. Like I will make fun of you to become friends with you. I will critique what you have to say as a way to show you that I care about you.
Right.
My mother-in-law is a 2. And so she's very empathetic and she cares about feelings. She's always caring about other people. And so there've been times that, not her, but other 2s, when like they want to talk about feelings and be like really emotional, I'm like, I can't do this. Like I cannot be your friend. Like this is just, it's not going to work. Yeah. And so it's taken me like, okay, this is what's happening. Understand this, go like the shadow work, like you described, go where you don't want to go. So I'm glad that you and your 2 wife are getting along. Good for you.
Yeah, well, we're it's new, and so then the next thing is we want to figure out what our kids are, and we have a blended family, so she's got her 2 daughters, I've got my 3 kids, and trying to make that all work. What
are their ages?
So my oldest is 22, and so I've got a 22-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old, and then Krista's oldest is 15, and youngest is 9.
Okay.
So we've got
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. And they're old enough where, especially the older ones, that they really can identify as their number. And because they say you're supposed to be around like 20 before you really know who you are.
Yeah.
On the other hand, my oldest daughter, she has heard my wife and I talk so much about the Enneagram that she knows it's the numbers and what it is. Mm-hmm. And she says, what's my number? And we will never tell her, but she is 100% an Enneagram number 1.
Okay.
And so we treat her different. I think my middle daughter's she's
how did you come to that conclusion? How did you recognize that she was a 1?
Well, okay. My wife is a 1 as well. And so that's a little background. She's always been more responsible than us, and she, or than me, which is
that's right. I think I heard you talk about how she'll come and wake you up,
but she is
for school.
Yeah, exactly. But the one of the stereotypical things about the 1 is the critical voice.
Right.
And I know my oldest daughter has that. I see it in her. I hear it in her. I hear it in the way that she talks about herself. And so for me as a dad, I want to step in and go, you need to know that you're loved, that you're valued, you are cherished. In a way that my middle daughter is probably a 7, who is actually 7 years old. That's not what she needs to hear as much. Like I tell her that all the time too, but it doesn't mean as much to her as it does to my oldest. Now, getting my middle daughter to deal with her feelings and talk about when she's sad, like she will reframe, jump, act cute, do something funny to get away from them. And for her, I need to teach her, you don't have to run.
Yeah.
We can sit in this together. I'm not going to make you do it a whole bunch, but we will do this for a few seconds.
Do you find that, so as a 7 in times of stress, you'll kind of take on characteristics of a 1, as a 7 in times of, comfort or security, you kind of act more like a 5. Do you feel like that experience helps you relate to your daughter who's a 1 more, that you're able to kind of see the world through her eyes a little bit differently from having some experience?
Yeah. I've always been sympathetic of 1s because I function in 1 space a lot. And I've tried to say that it's because I'm just, trying to be productive. But Ian and Suzanne have been like, no, I just think you're kind of stressed. But so I feel like I have a little taste of that. And I have a voyeur's experience with the critical voice. And I use that as definitely a way to foster compassion, not just for her, but also for my wife, who is a 1. And it helps Lindsay and I, because Lindsay will go, you're in your 1 space. Don't act like that. It's not good. Don't stay here. Go back. And it really is a litmus
So like
test.
if you're really being down on yourself or something, that self-critic is wagging its finger at you.
Yeah. I have this obsessive thing with routines. I eat the same thing. If I don't get everything off my check mark, I have multiple whiteboards with check marks that are required every day. Like, it's not like I did bad at work. It's like I am bad. And so I know that's not a healthy thing for me. And the invitation is to see that even if things aren't perfect, that doesn't change who you are.
And that's kind of a counter to a 7, right? Because sevens typically don't like the routines. Will find routines kind of boring.
Yeah, that's Ian Cron, who, like I said, wrote the book with Suzanne, their first one together, on the Enneagram. Yeah, you've like, I'm in a high stress, like pastor of a big church. You know, I have another book I'm turning in 2 weeks. I've got a podcast I run. And so I've got a handful of things on my plate. And for me, I think I want to do so much that I want to maximize every bit of life. So I'm going to make sure I get my work in. Make sure I can get my book writing done. I'm going to make sure I can get my sermon writing done. Make sure I'm going to interact with people. I'll make sure I can do my leadership stuff, get my podcast organized. And in some way there's like this gluttonous desire to have it all.
Right.
But another part is it can turn.
And that helps you manage it to do all the things you want to do, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I feel like it's helped me get a lot of things done. And I feel like it's helped me. I have this to-do list. I'm going to show you. This is terrible for a podcast, but I have this check. This is my sermon writing schedule.
Yeah.
And I literally am too far ahead. There's supposed to be like, these checks are supposed to stop right here, but I have sermons 10 weeks out that are way too far done. Like I need to stop that.
I find that admirable. I get a lot of stress from not planning that far ahead.
Anyway, that's the Enneagram. It gives you kind of wisdom into when you're struggling and when you're healthy. And so you have an Enneagram person coming on next week and doing like an Enneagram tutorial for
Carol, who is the one that walked me through that presentation. It was like a 8-hour. You know, we got there at like 9 a.m. We left at 5 p.m. So we're not going to cram all of that into an hour and a half podcast. But she'll talk about her experience with it and give an overview.
Yeah, the thing about the Enneagram, it's like this. It's like an accordion where you can see a little small bit of it, and then every time you pull it out, like there's more substance to it. And I've done, Suzanne and Ian did their podcast at my church. They flew down to Austin and we did 12 episodes together. I've done conferences with Suzanne here. I've done live events with them. And so I've done a handful of interviews with other Enneagram experts, but I'm still like learning so much.
Yeah.
Like there's still so many layers. I'm going, wow, I didn't even realize this. And it's so helpful.
Well, Suzanne's so impressive. I'd like to interview her at some point too, but she just like her 30 years experience, it seems to come so second nature to her. And, I think the hesitation that anybody has with any kind of personality typing thing is that, don't pigeonhole me. Don't tell me that I'm this certain way, because there's differences, there's variety. And I love how the Enneagram addresses that. And, I think, people usually talk about colors, how there's not like just a certain shade of blue, but there's multiple shades of blue and there's multiple shades of a 7 or, that sort of thing. And what's really interesting to me is when you start matching that with faith and matching it with like expectations of God or expectations of life, how all of that gets colored through your Enneagram type, your personality type. And, that's an interesting conversation. And
Suzanne
did something like that another time.
Yeah, Suzanne did this outstanding riff where she did why each number goes to mystery, and she did a riff like how everyone goes to mystery in their own different way, and their experience with it. She did it on a podcast on hers. Actually, the episode
it was part 2 of the one that she interviewed with you, where you felt like she set you up as a trick question.
So what numbers on the Enneagram? You've done a lot of Enneagram work. What numbers on the Enneagram do you think live best with mystery?
I mean, that's a great question. I should have asked you because you're going to have a better answer. I can riff about what I would guess.
Well, you need to riff because we're not switching places. This is my podcast.
All right. All right, Coach. You'd like to think that the 4s wanting to be authentic and kind of be willing to step in that space would almost come somewhat naturally. I would assume 4s might be comfortable there. I would imagine a 1 in their details would probably be pretty abhorrent to that sort of mystery because they want everything in the box. 5s would probably feel pretty paralyzed because they can't figure it out with enough information.
Look how good you're doing.
A 9 would be able to see both sides of things And so they could see how maybe it's a little bit this, a little bit that. An 8's not going to stop to think about it enough. So they're just going to put an action plan together. Your 3's, I don't know, maybe if they're in the right environment where everyone's saying that, that's what they'll say too. Again, they're not going to feel anything. I mean, we're kindred spirits. I want to know your answer to that question.
I think none of us do well with mystery. And so what I'm trying to lead us all to...
Hold on, you set up that whole question knowing the answer was wrong.
I didn't know how you were going to answer.
I thought
and
we were
it wasn't a setup. What I am leading us all to is we don't do well with mystery. And I think the next step after doing well with doubt is to be able to do well with mystery. I think there's always another step and another level and another step and another level. And I think we are living in a time that offers so many plausible answers, we don't even really know if they're the answers or not. They're plausible, so we take them. And I think we take them so readily because we can't live with mystery. And I think we can't live with mystery because we weren't taught to. And I think an inability to live with mystery is what causes us to have expectations of God. So I think I would probably walk through all 9 numbers. So I'm going to do that real quick about why it's hard for them to live with mystery. So I think it's hard for ones to live with mystery because they have to be right or correct. And they have to be right or correct because they don't think they're good. So they lean too heavily into their correctness because they think they are flawed in some way. And the way they make up for that is by being right or being correct. I think 2s can't live with mystery because they are so threatened by loss in relationship. So 2s in that space of threat can't wait for things to play out relationally. They try to make things play out. They go after answers. They go after what they want because they can't live with the threat of the mystery of not knowing how things are going to work out. And start noticing now that the answers to how we can't live with mystery are an exact measure almost of how much faith we don't have. Like mystery requires believing in something bigger than you that's happening beyond you, and we can't do that, right? 3s, I think, struggle to live with mystery only when it blocks a goal or their effectiveness or their efficiency or them bringing to fruition what they're trying to create. And otherwise, they're dismissive of mystery. It's like, if I don't need to know the answer, I don't care what the answer is. For 4s, adding on to what I said about 4's ability to bear witness to pain, which looks like they can live with mystery, I think 4s create mystery around themselves and around their behavior in order to level what they consider to be an unlevel playing field. And so if you can create this illusion of things that doesn't exactly define you, then as a 4, maybe you can get people to listen to you long enough to know you, to really want to know you. 5s don't live with mystery. Well, they don't talk about it and they don't accept it. They just research until they know what the answer is, or they take the question off the table. They don't live with mystery. 6s are drowning in their inability to handle mystery. And they're drowning in that inability to handle mystery in a culture where what keeps balance at an arm's length from 6s is all of this anxiety that's manufactured by the culture to make us afraid. 7s create mystery in order to not have to deal with it. 8s make up answers, and 8s believe that they can affect reality. So if something's mysterious and they can't figure out the answer, they give an answer. And then they kind of expect you to buy it. It's like this answer's as good as any, so we're going to go with this. And 9s, they are so intent on not being affected by life, on being unaffected by life is a better way of saying that. They're so intent on maintaining their peace and not having that be interrupted by the things that happen in life, that they use mystery to protect themselves.
Yeah, Suzanne did this outstanding riff where she did why each number goes to mystery. And she did a riff like how everyone goes to mystery in their own different way and their experience with it. She did it on a podcast on hers. Actually, the episode
it was part 2 of the one that she interviewed with you, where you felt like she set you up as a trick question.
Yeah, because and she was so brilliant. But it's the Enneagram is this lens that you see the world differently. And like I love the metaphor about there are like a million blues out there, but it's still blue. Like the essence is still blue. My dad, who's a psychologist, had some skepticism about this instrument.
Yeah.
Until he learned the way that they create space for all the different aspects of 7ness. And my dad's a 7 as well, like I said, but he functions as a 5. But he's also, his dissertation is in chronic pain. My mom's had chronic pain for much of my adult lifetime. That's who he works with. He was a professor as well, and his private practice with people who are suffering. He survived cancer himself. And so you see this person who has matured over the years and now occupies that healthy 5 space all the time. Like he still has 7ness in him. He will run from pain with the best of them, but now he resides like in this healthy space of where like 5 or 7s, when they function highly, like you said earlier, go to 5 space. And it's super helpful.
Yeah. That's where I thought I was when I first heard the Liturgist podcast on the Enneagram. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm a 5 because I like to spend time on my own. Every exchange is giving some kind of energy out and I need to recharge that. I'm an investigator. I like to look up things I like to understand and research and all that. But I think that's just a place that I go from my 7hood in times where I'm feeling more secure or whatever. So I've really enjoyed the Enneagram.
Good for you, man.
Finding more about it. But and thank you, Luke, for coming on. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, and I'll encourage my listeners to go out and check out your book, Good Over God.
Close. You almost got it.
Oh, God Over Good? Damn.
Yes, there you go.
Dang it. Okay.
You had such a good thumbnail earlier, so we'll just remind people of that.
I can edit it out and put anything in. I'm a little wizard when it comes to editing stuff.
Good for you, man. Well, thank you for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Luke.
You're good at this. I always respect a podcaster who's a good conversationalist. So,
well, appreciate it. Okay, thanks, man.
I did.
Talk to you later.
Hi, this is Hillary.
Matthew, Ryan,
Carol,
Keith,
Ashley, and I like to play bingo online while listening to Infants on Thrones.
You can comment on this episode on the website, infantsonthrones.com.
If you really like what you hear, give the Quorum a 5-star rating and write a short review on iTunes.
I did.
Anyone for the closing prayer?
Thank you for listening to Infants on Thrones.